Let us build the party, comrade.
Ah, forgot to unmute. Chapter 11. Yeah. Alright. 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 Chapter 11. Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually chapter 12. So I need to change something real fast. Alright. Okay. Chapter 12. Where are they now? And where are we? Chapter 12. Where are they now? And where are we? Dim Pasar. Wayan Bhadra, the Hindu priest, lives on the street where he grew up, in Seminyak, southwest Bali. But the neighborhood has changed drastically. That same beach that he used to walk on for 40 miles. Wait a minute. What do you want? That same beach that he used to walk on for 40 minutes every morning as he headed to school down in Kuta, it's certainly not empty. It's packed wall to wall with luxury resorts and, quote, beach clubs, a very common type of business on the island, where foreigners can sip cocktails all day and take a dip in a pool right on the sand. It's the same sand, of course, where the military brought people from Karabokan, a few miles east, to kill them at night. Right on the beach, a few feet from Bhadra's home, is one of the bigger, more upscale beach clubs in Bali. Seminyak has become one of the more expensive places to stay on the island, where the tourism usually revolves around wellness and spa treatment, or, quote, mindfulness, and meditation and massages, or, of course, sun and surfing. If aliens from another world landed on Bali, they would immediately conclude that our planet has racial hierarchy. The white people who come here for the white people who come here for vacation are orders of magnitude wealthier than the locals who serve them. The white people who come here for vacation are orders of magnitude wealthier than the locals who serve them. It is just accepted as a natural part of life. Almost everywhere in Southeast Asia, white people have the disposable income to buy lavish hospitality or sex from the locals. They are born with this wealth. Compared to the rest of Indonesia, Bali has done okay for itself economically as a result of the tourism. And Balinese people often obediently reproduce the, quote, Bali smile as they get Australian surfers their eggs or Russian Instagram models their coconuts. Fucking hell. Almost none of the tourists who come, no matter how well meaning and well educated, know what happened here, says Nagura Termana, the nephew of Agung Alit. the man who spent a darkly absurd afternoon sifting through skulls in search of his father's body. In contrast to Cambodia, where Western backpackers faithfully or morbidly visit the Killing Fields Museum outside Phnom Penh, uh, Phnom Penh. Few people who come to Bali are aware that a huge part of the local population was slaughtered right underneath their beach chairs. Quote, even when we meet with NGO groups, the most internationally informed type of people that know about Rwanda, Pol Pot, everything, no one has any idea what happened here, said Nagura Termana, who is a founding member of Taman 65, or the 1965 Garden, a collective dedicated to promoting memory of reconciliation on the island. The group put out a book on the killings in Bali, as well as a CD of songs that prisoners sang in the concentration camps here. The members of Taman 65 know that there is a reason none of the tourists know about the violence that took the lives of so many of their relatives. The government has buried that history deep, even deeper than it was buried on the island of Java. The tourism boom, which started in the late 1960s, required that Before Suharto, a huge amount of Bali's land was communal and often disputed. Quote, they needed to kill the communists so that foreign investors could bring their capital here, said Nagura Termana. Quote, now all visitors here see is our famous smile, he continued. Quote, they have no idea the darkness and fire that works underneath. The Luxury Beach Club, a few steps away from Wayland Badra's home, has a name that is almost comically on the nose. It's called Coup d'etat, Bahasa Indonesia for, quote, coup d'etat. I asked the staff there if they knew why that might be ironic. They did not. Over the years, Lewin Badra and his neighbors have found bones and skulls on the sand around Coup d'etat. As the elder priest for this village, he takes it upon himself to give the bodies a proper Hindu funeral. Recently, one of the villagers made a mistake. He kept a skull for himself in his office and put it next to some flowers on a table. Playing around, he put a hat on the skull. Quote, maybe the person who died didn't like being treated like this. The skull started to move. On its own, Wei Yan Petra said, the man got scared and quickly brought it to Wayland Badra for a respectable, proper burial. Shit. What was I wanting to look up again? Okay. Stanford. I met Benny Lidiono at his home in Connecticut. It took a very long time to find him. At first, he was just a rumor, an Indonesian who had lived in Chile under Pinochet. I had to chase leads across a few countries, but he became very real to me and a valued friend. After his time trying to help rebuild Cambodia, Benny settled into academic life in the United States, teaching at the University of Connecticut, and writing a book about the UN's successes and many failures in Cambodia. He was wickedly funny in person. When he recounted his stories about trips to strip clubs back in Kansas in the 1950s, he'd cover his mouth, pretending to hide the story from his smiling wife. After hours of showing me his photos and his materials on Cambodia, he drove me back to the train station. At the spry age of 82, just a few weeks later, he finally became a U.S. citizen. He kept in touch for months after that. I'd call to ask follow-up questions, or he'd send me news and links over WhatsApp. One day, he sent me a note. It looked like a mass message, saying that he was going in for heart surgery. I wished him my best. Then I sent him a get well card from Guatemala. Then I called his home later to see how he was doing. I had just missed him. His wife told me he had died a week earlier. I wanted to dedicate this book to him and to Francesca Patapoli, and to all the innocent victims of state terror in the 20th century. Sao Paulo. Ng Gyak Tan met me near Praça da República, just below my apartment in Brazil's largest city. The meeting was convenient for her. It was October 2018, and she was marching in a rally there to stop Jair Bolsonaro from being elected. 58 years old, wearing red and absolutely radiant, she was in the square with a few friends, waving flags and passing out pamphlets. This was not one of the huge, all-inclusive anti-Bolsonaro marches that all kinds of people went to. This was a group of dedicated activists, the kind who were out there a few times a week. And they were going to lose. That was becoming increasingly clear. This very moment, as Bolsonaro breezed to the second round of voting without even showing up to debate his opponent for the left-wing Workers' Party, PT, was perhaps the lowest point for the Brazilian left since democracy had returned. This very moment, as Bolsonaro breezed to the second round of voting without even showing up to debate his opponent from the left-wing Workers' Party, PT, was perhaps the lowest point for the Brazilian left since democracy had returned. But Ng Gyak was out there with 5 or 6 women, unafraid to defend Lula, the popular former president, and the country's first left-wing leader since the fall of the dictatorship. She had been a supporter of the PT, his party, since she voted for him in 1989. In that election, Brazil's TV Globo manipulated the footage of a key debate between Lula and Fernando Collor, who went on to win and then be impeached for corruption. But she became especially active in 2016 as gathering right-wing forces assembled in the attempt to impeach Dilma Rousseff. She didn't think that would turn out well. She was right. If you had to sum up Jair Bolsonaro's political career in 2 words, quote, violent anti-communism would be a very good choice. He was an unremarkable soldier and an unremarkable politician, popping between 9 parties over 2 decades in the lower house of the legislature. The only noteworthy thing about him was that he would sometimes scream into empty congressional chambers or on late-night TV that everyone was a communist, or that the state should have killed more leftists. He once said, quote, voting won't change anything in this country. Nothing. Things will only change, unfortunately, after starting a civil war here, and doing the work the dictatorship didn't do, killing some 30,000 people and starting with FHC, referring to then President Fernando Henrique Cardoso of the Brazilian Social Democratic Party. If some innocents die, that's just fine. Shit, man. Over the years, his vehement defense of the dictatorship, including its most abhorrent practices, shocked and dismayed even the military high command, who preferred to leave those things in the past, or at least unsaid. Bolsonaro's ideology can be traced directly back to 1975, into the days of Operation Jakarta. Back then, there was a split within the military. General Geisel wanted a gradual democratic opening, and a radical group within the military, whose power derived from terror, opposed this apertura. The leader of this ultra-right faction was Brian Hante Ustra, the man Bolsonaro praised during his impeachment vote on the day I met him. Quote, Bolsonaro represents the faction of the armed forces that gained power when torture became an important part of the military regime, wrote Celso Roca de Barros in Folca de Espalo. In other words, his presidency is the return of the very impulse that led to anti-communism mass murder in the 20th century. Inkiak is now Brazilian in every way, to the extent that she is now just, quote, ing, pronounced, quote, ing, in the local style. Words in Brazilian Portuguese can't end on a consonant. I also got to meet much of the Indonesian community in Brazil. They are almost all of Chinese descent. Some were conservative, some were center-left. None of them knew that the original anti-Chinese riots in Indonesia were the result of U.S. policy in the region. Some of them had no idea why they really came to Brazil in the first place. Others, like Hedianti Lesmana and Hindra Winardi, came later, after the chaos of 1965 to 1966, when anti-Chinese sentiments in Jakarta's student community made life for them very difficult. Hindra went on to start a very successful engineering career in Brazil, literally building some of its most important architectural landmarks. Hindra went on to start a very successful engineering career in Brazil, literally building some of its most important architectural landmarks. His company helped build 5 of the World Cup stadiums in preparation for the 2014 event that now feels like it took place in a different, much better world. Ying Yak and I spoke many times. When I got back to my computer after one of our conversations, I checked Twitter, and something caught my eye. Bolsonaro supporters had already been calling members of the international press, quote, communist for weeks, because of our critical coverage. But this time, the accusation came with an illustration, clearly old. There was a red, devilish hand holding a long spike, as if to stab the heart of Brazil, and it was being held back by another hand, this one green. It was obvious what it meant. The communists wanted to destroy the country, but the military would save them. And I recognized this one and checked my history books. It was an illustration created in the 1930s, based on the legend of the communists murdering generals in the middle of the night. The myth surrounding the Intentona Comunista. Bolsonaro was elected on October 28, 2018. I was in Rio, furiously tapping up a story as the final results came in. Below me, on the streets of Leme, few blocks from Copacabana Beach. I, I heard screaming and ran to the window to witness a brief, very explosion, early explosion of political violence. That day, many of the people in the neighborhood that had been wearing stickers supporting Haddad, the left wing, that day, many of the people in the neighborhood had been wearing stickers supporting Haddad, the left-wing candidate. Quote, Comunistas, Comunistas. A group of bulky men started screaming at them. Quote, Fascistas. A few women screamed back, but they were scared. These guys were a lot bigger than them, and they shuffled off quickly, removing their stickers. After the results, I spoke to Ivo Herzog, the son of Vladimir Herzog, the journalist killed in the putative Operation Jakarta. Quote, I think we may be taking a huge step backwards. I'm very afraid, he said. Quote, the political situation puts me under intense stress. I can't sleep without medication. But I've decided now is not the time to back down from the fight. Oh, fuck, man. Damn. I gotta check something real fast. Yeah. Man. Alright. Alright. Oops. Oh, excuse me. Paris. I was sitting and waiting in the Jakarta, Bali, an Indonesian restaurant a few blocks from the Louvre, when an elderly woman came zooming toward the front door. I couldn't see her feet, so I was confused how she was going this fast. But then she hopped off a razor scooter and walked in. It was Neri Hanafi, the daughter of Sukarno's ambassador to Cuba. This restaurant is her family's, opened in Paris after they came here from Cuba. On the walls, there are photos of her father with Che and with Fidel, back in the days when they thought they were building a tri-continental movement. We had the excellent Daging Sapi Rendang, one of my favorite dishes from Indonesia. She told me the scooter was her, quote, Harley Davidson. It might have looked strange, a white American man and an old Asian woman speaking Spanish in Paris. After years in Bulgaria, she came back here. It was reunited with her family. But even in Paris, she couldn't escape the stigma of communism. The Indonesian embassy in Paris refused to recognize the restaurant ever existed. She doesn't know that country she belongs to. She feels she lost Indonesia back in 1965. Quote, when I talk to younger people from Indonesia now, I realize we don't have the same history. She said, quote, I don't mean that we have different personal stories. I mean, they don't even know the truth of what our country used to be, our struggle for independence, and the values we held. Life for the exiles in Europe and Asia remains hard, but she admits quickly things for victims back home have been much worse. Oh, man. Solo. Magdalena has been beautiful her entire life. All throughout the time she was in prison, guards tried to marry her. She resisted, even though she knew this would help her situation, maybe even get her out early. She didn't want a relationship like that. When she did get out of the prison, more men tried to marry her. She resisted. She didn't feel safe with any man who had not been imprisoned himself. She knew that she was marked for life as a communist, as a witch. Any regular man was likely to view her as a reject, she worried, and treat her like garbage if and when he felt like it. Quote, "How could I trust a regular man to be my husband?" She asked me. Quote, "What if he got angry? He could just beat me, call me a communist, and no one would help me." Much worse things happened than this to the families of communists and accused communists. In Indonesia, being a communist marked you for life as evil, and in many cases, this is seen as something that passes down to your offspring, as if it were a genetic deformity. Children of accused communists were tortured or killed. Some women were prosecuted simply for setting up an orphanage for the children of communist victims. One Indonesian businessman chose One Indonesian businessman close to Washington warned U.S. officials years after the killings that a strong military was needed because of the offspring of the communists were growing up. Oh, fuck, man. Magdalena is serene and radiant at 71, but also shy and guarded. She lives alone in a tiny one-bedroom shack down an alleyway in the city of Solo in central Java. She lives on 200,000 rupiah a month, or about 14 US dollars. She gets a tiny bit of help from her local church, which supplies her with a monthly stipend of 5 kilos of rice. But she has no family, and she has none of the traditional ties to her community that sustain most women of her age. Those were cut when she was accused of being a communist. When I first pushed my motorcycle down the little road to her home and walked into her living room, I couldn't believe my eyes. This was not how elderly Indonesians live. They live in houses with big families, and if they don't have that, the neighborhood takes care of them. As I walked into her house, no one on her street greeted us. She was not wrong when she figured that she would be marked for life. This kind of situation is extremely common for survivors of the 1965 violence and repression. There are an estimated tens of millions of victims or relatives of victims still alive in Indonesia, and almost all live in worse situations than they deserve. This ranges from abject poverty and social isolation to simply being denied the admission that a parent or grandparent was killed unjustly, that their family was not guilty of anything at all. The small organization that advocates for survivors in this region, Secretariat Bersama 65, has fought for decades for recognition of the crimes committed against people like Magdalena. The survivors thought there could be some kind of truth commission or national reconciliation process. They thought there should be reparations paid to the victims. They thought, at least, there should be a public apology for what happened to them, an affirmation that they are not less than human. None of that has taken place. Back in 2017, when I first arranged to meet survivors, Bhaskara Wardaya, a Jesuit priest and historian who specializes in 1965, warned me, quote, "Many survivors are tired of talking, tired of fighting. It's been so long, and they've gotten absolutely nowhere. The mayor of Solo in 1965 was a member of the Communist Party named Somo Ramon. Over the years, as I visited Solo and met survivors, I met quite a few people who had worked in his administration. Young Indonesians just excited to get an official job at City Hall. After Suharto took over the country, he was arrested and sentenced to death. In 2005, a former businessman in the furniture industry, Joko, quote, Jokowi Widodo, was elected mayor of Solo. In 2014, he was elected president. His candidacy was supported by a range of human rights groups, many of which thought that as the first leader of Indonesia who did not come from Suharto's military oligarchical nexus, he would recognize and apologize for the crimes of 1965, or start some inquiry on the 15th anniversary of the killings. They were wrong. Not long after starting, he smiled and told reporters he had, quote, no thoughts about apologizing. In 2017, the year my roommate was terrorized in Jakarta for attending a conference in 1965, Jokowi, who had been accused of being a communist himself, took a stronger position. Quote, if the PKI comes back, just beat them up, he said. In 2019, Jokowi was re-elected for another 5-year term. I had a very hard time in Solo. These interviews are very hard to do, and I had to go slow. So the weeks were long and rigorous. At first, I thought I could speak to Indonesians with the help of an interpreter, but it quickly became clear that many people are still far too traumatized and too afraid of the stigma still attached to them in their old age to speak freely in front of an Indonesian they don't know or trust. Even for those who would speak to me through an interpreter, the questioning was far too delicate to pass the responsibility for wording onto someone else. So I improved my skills in that language enough to do one-on-one interviews, and slowly earn their trust. I talked to many people whose stories I could not include. Some, it became clear, did not really feel comfortable telling their full stories, and many others did bravely, helping to shape my understanding of the events as I selected the few stories I could pick for a book like this. I feel guilty even admitting the process was very psychologically difficult for me, thus my tiny ordeal pales in comparison to theirs. Because I could go back and live a comfortable life in the United States whenever I wanted. And so I had to spend a lot of time in the town's new mega mall, where all the important businesses are. In some ways, the mega mall now functions as the cultural center of Indonesian cities, with children's concerts in the lobby. People can wander aimlessly, buying iced coffee and donuts. Often escalators leave you quite literally trapped on its upper floors. So you wander more and buy something else. And like every other mall in Indonesia, the music on the speakers is American produced pop almost all the time. You do not hear Indonesian music. You do not hear Japanese music, even K-pop, or anything from Asia, nor European or Latin American music. it will all have been packaged and sold in the USA. Fuck, man. Sakono also lives near Solo. He's still very feisty, and still applying sharp political analysis to the world around him. Unlike Magdalena, he can talk about the old days without going quiet, without staring off into the distance, or breaking into tears. Like Magdalena, he converted to Christianity in prison. This is also very common among survivors, especially among 1965 victims who were raised to observe the Javanese form of Islam. After being accused of atheism, communists were rejected by the large Muslim institutions in Java, which often collaborated in the killings. But they still believed in God and sought spiritual comfort from the material horrors of their lives. The only thing Sakono likes to talk about more than Marxism is grace and forgiveness. He is adamant that he holds nothing against his captors or the men who killed his friends. He wants no vengeance and is at peace with his past. But he's equally adamant that his country is not at peace with this history. Quote, "The solution is for this nation to recognize its sins and repent. I value even the most difficult experiences I went through, because they taught me to show love to everyone." He said, quote, "If we can recognize what our nation has done and ask for forgiveness, we can move forward." Quote, the solution is for this nation to recognize its sins and to repent. I value even the most difficult experiences I went through because they taught me to show love to everyone. He said, quote, "If we can recognize what our nation has done and ask for forgiveness, we can move forward." New York City. 30 Rockefeller Plaza is a big building in Midtown Manhattan. I had never been there before, though I had heard of it. I think I caught a couple episodes of 30 Rock with Tina Fey and Tracy Morgan, whose title made the address even more famous. It's clearly a place tourists visit. On the ground floor, the walls display pictures of Seinfeld and Friends and all the other shows that NBC has produced. On the 23rd floor is Squire Patton Boggs, a, quote, white shoe law firm. Frank Wisner Jr. has an office there. He served in the State Department for decades, including as Reagan's ambassador to Egypt and the Philippines, and as Bill Clinton's ambassador to India. But I mostly asked him about his father. Things he remembered him saying about Indonesia or the fight against communism. It would be unfair to make him answer for the deeds of his father. But there was one thing he could tell me, one myth he wanted to dispel. He told me that whether or not the CIA overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union, despite he told me that whether or not the CIA overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union, and despite what the outcome might have been, his father truly thought that he was fighting communism. He didn't think he was doing it to help his business buddies back in New York. He thought it was about the cause. For what it is worth, I believe that he believed that. After going very carefully over the 1950s and 1960s, we talked about life in Indonesia now. Packing my bag, I remarked that for many countries, that history is hugely important to this day. While Americans may have forgotten about these events in those countries, the residents don't have the option to forget. Wisner agreed with me quickly and enthusiastically. That's true, he said. As I stood up to leave, in many ways we are, quote, the land of the great amnesiac, he said. Quote, we have a psychological habit of looking ahead and not behind, he said, musing freely, as friendly men in their 80s often do. He said the U.S. government would have not gotten itself into its current situation in the Middle East if we had paid attention to history. Speaking with dark sarcasm, he finished, quote, there's a long and honorable record of American indifference to the world around us. San Diego. Carmen Hertz is a busy woman. She's a congresswoman now. She's a congresswoman now, elected in 2017. She's still in the Communist Party, which has 8 members in the Cámara de Diputados, led by young former student leader Camila Vallejo. When I tell Indonesian victims of 1965 to 1966 that it's sort of okay to be a communist now in parts of Latin America, where even the former guerrillas, ones in prison, became presidents, they can't believe it. But reconciliation did happen, of some kind, in much of South America. Chile, as a center-right capitalist country, is far from perfect. It's certainly not what Carmen thought the world would be back in 1970, when she and her friends believed they were on their way to building a world without poverty or exploitation. San Diego has a powerful monument to the victims of the Pinochet regime, called the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos. As you walk in, there's a single candle lit for every single person killed by the dictatorship. The guides on the walls do not shy from the fact that many of the victims were indeed leftists, even communists, or supporters of Marxist armed struggle. One wall has a small display of every single truth and reconciliation process that has ever taken place. In South Africa, in Argentina, in more than 30 countries, there's the beginning of a small plaque for Indonesia. Then it ends abruptly. Quote, Indonesia abolished the law that would establish their Truth Commission. Jakarta.